Though the first task must now be to win the war. To win it will only gain us another opportunity to face the basic problems, and to find a way of averting the fate which has overtaken kindred civilizations. Now, it is somewhat difficult to think of Germany and Italy, or of Russia, not as different worlds, but as products of a development of thought in which we have shared. It is, at least so far as our enemies are concerned, easier and more comforting to think that they are entirely different from us, and that what happened there cannot happen here. Yet the history of these countries in the years before the rise of the totalitarian system showed few features with which we are not familiar. The external conflict is a result of a transformation of European thought, in which others have moved so much faster as to bring them into irreconcilable conflict with our ideals, but which has not left us unaffected. That a change of ideas and the force of human will have made the world what it is now, though men did not foresee the results, and that no spontaneous change in the facts obliged us thus to adapt our thought as perhaps particularly difficult for the Anglo-Saxon nations to see, just because in this development they have, fortunately for them, lagged behind most of the European peoples. We still think of the ideals which guide us, and have guided us for the past generation, as ideals only to be realized in the future, and are not aware how far in the last 25 years they have already transformed not only the world, but also our own countries. We still believe that, until quite recently, we were governed by what are vaguely called 19th century ideas, or the principle of laissez-faire. Compared with some other countries, and from the point of view of those impatient to speed up the change, there may be some justification for such belief. But although until 1931 England and America had followed only slowly on the path on which others had led, even by then they had moved so far that only those whose memory goes back to the years before the last war know what a liberal world has been like. Even in that year, the Macmillan Report could already speak of the change of outlook of the government of this country in recent times, its growing preoccupation, irrespective of party, with the management of the like of the people, and add that Parliament finds itself increasingly engaged in legislation which has for its conscious aim the regulation of the day-to-day affairs of the community, and now intervenes in matters formerly thought to be entirely outside its scope. This could be said before, later in the same year, England finally took the headlong plunge and, in the short space of the inglorious years 1931 to 1939, transformed its economic system beyond recognition. The crucial point of which our people are still so little aware is, however, not merely the magnitude of the changes which have taken place during the last generation, but the fact that they mean a complete change in the direction of the evolution of our ideas and social order. For at least 25 years before the specter of totalitarianism became a real threat, we had progressively been moving away from the basic ideas on which Western civilization has been built. That this movement on which we have entered with such high hopes and ambitions should have brought us face to face with the totalitarian horror has come as a profound shock to this generation, which still refuses to connect the two facts. Yet this development merely confirms the warnings of the fathers of the liberal philosophy which we still profess. We have progressively abandoned that freedom in economic affairs without which personal and political freedom has never existed in the past. Although we had been warned by some of the greatest political thinkers of the 19th century, by de Tocqueville and Lord Acton, that socialism means slavery, we have steadily moved in the direction of socialism. And now that we have seen a new form of slavery arise before our eyes, we have so completely forgotten the warning that it scarcely occurs to us that the two things may be connected. Even much more recent warnings, which have proved dreadfully true, have been almost entirely forgotten. It is not yet 30 years since Hilaire Belloc, in a book which explains more of what has happened since in Germany than most works written after the event, explained that the effect of socialist doctrine on capitalist society is to produce a third thing different from either of its two begetters, to wit, the servile state, The Servile State, 1913, 3rd edition, 1927, page XIV. How sharp a break, not only with the recent past, but with the whole evolution of Western civilization, the modern trend towards socialism means, becomes clear if we consider it not merely against the background of the 19th century, but in a longer historical perspective. We are rapidly abandoning not the views merely of Cobden and Bright, of Adam Smith and Hume, or even of Locke and Milton, but one of the salient characteristics of Western civilization as it has grown from the foundations laid by Christianity and the Greeks and Romans. Not merely 19th and 18th century liberalism, but the basic individualism inherited by us from Erasmus and Montaigne, from Cicero and Tacitus, Pericles and Thucydides, is progressively relinquished. The Nazi leader who described the National Socialist Revolution as a counter-Renaissance spoke more truly than he probably knew. It was the decisive step in the destruction of that civilization which modern man had built up from the age of the Renaissance, and which was, above all, an individualist civilization. Individualism has a bad name today, and the term has come to be connected with egotism and selfishness. But the individualism of which we speak in contrast to socialism, and all other forms of collectivism, has no necessary connection with these. Only gradually, in the course of this book, shall we be able to make clear the contrast between the two opposing principles. But the essential features of that individualism which, from elements provided by Christianity and the philosophy of classical antiquity, was first fully developed during the Renaissance, and has since grown and spread into what we know as Western civilization, are the respect for the individual man qua man, that is, the recognition of his own views and tastes as supreme in his own sphere, however narrowly that may be circumscribed, and the belief that it is desirable that men should develop their own individual gifts and bents. Freedom and liberty are now words so worn with use and abuse that one must hesitate to employ them to express the ideals for which they stood during that period. Tolerance is, perhaps, the only word which still preserves the full meaning of the principle which, during the whole of this period, was in the ascendant, and which only in recent times has again been in decline, to disappear completely with the rise of the totalitarian state. The gradual transformation of a rigidly organized, hierarchic system into one where men could at least attempt to shape their own life, where man gained the opportunity of knowing and choosing between different forms of life, is closely associated with the growth of commerce. From the commercial cities of northern Italy, the new view of life spread with commerce to the west and north, through France and the southwest of Germany, to the Low Countries and the British Isles, taking firm root wherever there was no despotic political power to stifle it. In the Low Countries and Britain, it, for a long time, enjoyed its fullest development, and for the first time had an opportunity to grow freely and to become the foundation of the social and political life of these countries. And it was from there that, in the late 17th and 18th centuries, it again began to spread, in a more fully developed form, to the west and east, to the New World and to the center of the European continent, where devastating wars and political oppression had largely submerged the earlier beginnings of a similar growth. The most fateful of these developments, pregnant with consequences not yet extinct, was the subjection and partial destruction of the German bourgeoisie by the territorial princes in the 15th and 16th centuries. During the whole of this modern period of European history, the general direction of social development was one of freeing the individual from the ties which had bound him to the customary or prescribed ways in the pursuit of his ordinary activities. The conscious realization that the spontaneous and uncontrolled efforts of individuals were capable of producing a complex order of economic activities could come only after this development had made some progress. The subsequent elaboration of a consistent argument in favor of economic freedom was the outcome of a free growth of economic activity, which had been the undesigned and unforeseen byproduct of political freedom. Perhaps the greatest result of the unchaining of individual energies was the marvelous growth of science, which followed the march of individual liberty from Italy to England and beyond. That the inventive faculty of man had been no less in earlier periods is shown by the many highly ingenious automatic toys and other mechanical contrivances constructed while industrial technique still remained stationary, and by the development in some industries which, like mining or watchmaking, were not subject to restrictive controls. But the few attempts toward a more extended industrial use of mechanical inventions, some extraordinarily advanced, were promptly suppressed, and the desire for knowledge was stifled, so long as the dominant views were held to be binding for all. The beliefs of the great majority on what was right and proper were allowed to bar the way of the individual innovator. Only since industrial freedom opened the path to the free use of new knowledge, only since everything could be tried, if somebody could be found to back it at his own risk, and, it should be added, as often as not from outside the authorities officially entrusted with the cultivation of learning, has science made the great strides which, in the last 150 years, have changed the face of the world. As is so often true, the nature of our civilization has been seen more clearly by its enemies than by most of its friends. The perennial Western malady, the revolt of the individual against the species, as that 19th-century totalitarian Auguste Comte has described it, was indeed the force which built our civilization. What the 19th century added to the individualism of the preceding period was merely to make all classes conscious of freedom, to develop systematically and continuously what had grown in a haphazard and patchy manner, and to spread it from England and Holland over most of the European continent. The result of this growth surpassed all expectations. Wherever the barriers to the free exercise of human ingenuity were removed, man became rapidly able to satisfy ever-widening ranges of desire, and while the rising standard soon led to the discovery of very dark spots in society, spots which men were no longer willing to tolerate, there was probably no class that did not substantially benefit from the general advance. We cannot do justice to this astonishing growth if we measure it by our present standards, which themselves result from this growth, and now make many defects obvious. To appreciate what it meant to those who took part in it, we must measure it by the hopes and wishes men held when it began, and there can be no doubt that its success surpassed man's wildest dreams, that by the beginning of the 20th century, the working man in the Western world had reached a degree of material comfort, security, and personal independence which, 100 years before, had seemed scarcely possible. What in the future will probably appear the most significant and far-reaching effect of this success is the new sense of power over their own fate, the belief in the unbounded possibilities of improving their own lot, which the success already achieved created among men. With the success grew ambition, and man had every right to be ambitious. What had been an inspiring promise seemed no longer enough, the rate of progress far too slow, and the principles which had made this progress possible in the past came to be regarded more as obstacles to speedier progress, impatiently to be brushed away, than as the conditions for the preservation and development of what had already been achieved. There is nothing in the basic principles of liberalism to make it a stationary creed. There are no hard and fast rules, fixed once and for all. The fundamental principle that in the ordering of our affairs we should make as much use as possible of the spontaneous forces of society, and resort as little as possible to coercion, is capable of an infinite variety of applications. There is, in particular, all the difference between deliberately creating a system within which competition will work as beneficially as possible and passively accepting institutions as they are.